the church in Galatia was a church founded and created by Paul and created during his ministry and by his proclamation of the gospel. He went around this area, Asia Minor, Greece, and he was preaching the gospel to all these different towns, and Galatia is one of those towns. He started a church there, but it didn't really take that long after Paul left the area, left the city, and left the church to its own to kind of thrive and try to set them up and let them run on their, he had trained them up and he had left. It didn't take long after he left them before they became infiltrated with false doctrine of mainly works-based salvation. And this is what Paul is really trying to address in the letter. And the corruptors were Jewish, and Paul thinks that they were working for their own prestige and to win approval from the Jewish authorities, we read. So he really, it seemed like there were some Jewish pseudo-Christians who had come in and tried to corrupt the teaching of the gospel into a works-based gospel that had to do with following the law and following the Mosaic law and covenant of circumcision and eating the right foods and practicing all the festivals and feasts that were formerly established and formerly followed before Christ came. Now, this false gospel, and that would earn salvation, and if they didn't do those things, that they couldn't earn salvation. So this false gospel had also created a lot of division within the church, and the epistle to the Galatians is purposed to correct this theology and to focus them back on the gospel of grace that he originally taught them, that Jesus saves them, and that they don't need to follow this law, especially as Gentiles, that they didn't need to get themselves caught up in this circumcision that the Jewish infiltrators were trying to get them to follow. And Paul sets up this section here in chapter 4. Right before this section, and at the end of chapter 3, he's talking about captivity to the law, captivity to the Mosaic law, and the insufficiency of the law to give life and to restore righteousness, to give everlasting life. And he says that the law acted as a guardian by being a demonstration of faith. Also that, faith was a guardian until Christ came. So people were still saved before Christ came, but it was like being enslaved to a system. And of course, they had to prove their faith through works and through obedience to the law in a certain way and other things. We read about how Abraham was justified by, bringing Isaac to the altar. But Paul says, he ends chapter 3 with these statements. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ now, for you are all one in Christ. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to promise. According to the promise. So he says, you were a slave to this old system, this law. But now that you've been baptized in Christ, and now that Christ has come, he's been able to set you free from that system of slavery, which I talked about on my last podcast. And he's brought you into this offspring of Abraham. He's brought you into this family because Abraham's offspring were promised an inheritance. And so now, by joining in with Christ, who is a descendant of Abraham, we join in with that inheritance and we become heirs according to promise.